Hello, everyone. Welcome. Here we are today for our conversation, The Financial Crime Divide, where policy, technology, and compliance collide. So we'll just take a moment or two. I know folks are joining our live stream here, so we'll just give it a minute as people are signing in. And I'll just take a moment to say thanks to our hosts from the Illicit Edge Network, and thanks to Hummingbird. We're very excited for the support today, and I'm ELAINE DEZENSKI, host of the Coercive Capital Podcast here on the Illicit Edge Network, and head of the Center on Economic and Financial Power at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, a think tank here in Washington, D.C. And I'm joined with MATT VAN BUSKIRK, co-founder and CEO at Hummingbird RegTech, a leading voice in modern AML and regulatory technology. Matt, so good to have you here.
Thank you for having me. The foundation you're with, that mission is incredibly important, so very happy that you're working so closely on that.
Appreciate that. And thank you for your support of the Illicit Edge Network and the podcast. I know we're going to have a chance for some audience Q&A as we go through the conversation today, but I just wanted to start with a little bit about you. You have such a great background. You started your career as a regulator. You're back in the Washington, D.C. area, which is great. Nice to have you as a neighbor here. Tell us a little bit about how you came into this space and all the great work at Hummingbird.
I always wanted to get into the technology field, but I graduated right at the beginning of the financial crisis, and the Microsoft Xbox division wasn't hiring, so I had to look for alternatives, and the Treasury Department was hiring a lot of people. So my first job right out of college was as a bank examiner, traveling around the country. The first couple of thrifts we went into, I was with the Office of Thrift Supervision. One of them we ended up eventually closing down, which was quite a learning experience for a recent college graduate. But always was interested in technology. Left the government, eventually found my way into joining Circle, the company behind the USCC stablecoin. Joined them back in early 2014 as their first head of compliance. And it was my first experience working with real technologists. I was the general counsel I reported to and I were the only people with a regulatory background. But everyone else in the company were the best tech people I've ever worked with. And the epiphany we had back then that you could fix a lot of this stuff is saying, if you can sit those type of people down and get them focused on this type of mission, some really cool stuff can come out from it. And I met my co-founder, Joe, there. So that's where the origin of Hummingbird came from.
That's great. Well, I think that that type of exposure is where the challenges become clear and where the solutions also get formulated. So I want to kick us off today talking about the policy environment here in Washington, D.C. And I'll start with a couple of comments from Undersecretary John Hurley. He's the new Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence at Treasury, and he made some remarks last month at the ACAMS conference. He said, quote, "Our concept for reforming the system is simple. First, law enforcement and the national security establishment are the customers of our AML CFT system, and our North Star will be to remain laser focused on that customer. Second, AML CFT programs should deliver better by providing customers with the most useful information, not by overwhelming the system with noise. And finally, compliance takes real resources. That's why prioritization matters." So this is interesting. It's a signal, I think, that we may be looking at some shifts in the AML CFT policy landscape. So what do you think is driving that conversation right now, and any change that you're seeing?
Yeah, it's been we founded the company a bit more than 8 years ago, and we'd been hoping that this type of change would come into effect. Thinking back to that experience at Circle, I think is coming to what we're seeing here more broadly. The ability to work with those technologists and actually build bespoke systems in-house that could help us more accurately target bad actors and streamline the experience for our good customers. I could not do that with any existing sort of off-the-shelf status quo approach. We had to kind of invent it. And I through that experience, I ended up meeting a lot of people in the law enforcement community who were interested in the tools we had built. I had an opportunity to go and speak to a number of law enforcement conferences on kind of using machine learning for behavioral fingerprinting, all that kind of stuff. And just had this core belief that if we go back to the origins of the whole anti-money laundering regime we have today, we would not design it as it is today. If we had the tools back then, it would be much more data sciences focused, a lot less on sort of people and paperwork and procedure. And I think that the trend we're seeing here is sort of for a long time, we've been doing the best we could. Like, you can't fault anyone for decisions that were made over the past 5 decades. But there reaches a sort of point where we need to acknowledge that the status quo isn't achieving the results we would want it to. And that point is when we need to sort of go back to first principles and rethink what this should look like. And the speech from the Undersecretary I was at the conference there too, and I was very much aligned with that point of view, saying we can have both efficiency for the financial industry and effectiveness in terms of quality information being provided for law enforcement so they can go after bad actors. Historically, it's always been an either or, like a regulatory pendulum, where we get more heavy regulation and then that leads to deregulation and kind of a whipsaw effect. If we can actually break that pendulum now and rebuild it into something that can produce quantifiable results that the law enforcement intelligence community needs without so much burden on the financial industry, I think it's a very exciting opportunity for all of us.
Yeah. And what's behind that trend, or how do you see the pressure coming? Is it really because technology is now becoming available to be more outcome focused in an AML CFT regime? Is it more about the geopolitical dynamics and maybe the threat vectors? Like, how do you see this window that seems to be opening for rethinking what this compliance framework should look like and what it should do?
It's a little bit of a perfect storm. The threat ecosystem is definitely maturing very quickly. The scam industry, by some estimates, now exceeding narcotics in terms of producing criminal revenue. I was always quoting the UN and IMF numbers that we have somewhere between $3 and $5 trillion in global money laundering every year. I decided it's a little bit more impactful to say, like, if the criminal economy was a country, it would be a member of the G7. So we have a lot of risk out there, a lot of bad things happening. And now I was in London a couple of weeks ago and heard a talking point saying that the advent of AI in the criminal world is changing the economies of scale for the scam industry, where previously they were primarily targeting Europe and America because people have more money, but saying if you can fully automate a scam operation, you can go after someone whose entire net worth maybe $50 and still do it efficiently and make money off of it. So it's going to become rapidly a global problem.
Yeah.
Thankfully, it's happening at the same time, though, that the solutions to this exist. Like, it's becoming basically glaringly obvious that we cannot fight multinational G7 economy level expenditure criminal entities with Excel spreadsheets, which has been kind of the most common fallback for financial crime professionals for a long period of time. So the convergence, I think, partially is happening as a downstream effect of the crypto industry needing to figure out how to close a lot of gaps. What attracted me to join Circle was that premise, basically saying, like, we do not have a rule book to figure out or to follow here. So we need to invent something that will make regulators and policymakers comfortable with what's being done, but do it in a new way. And I met my co-founder basically by kidnapping a bunch of his engineers to build in-house tools at Circle. And if you look at all the crypto companies and the big fintechs that are out there, they have a much higher percentage of data scientists and engineers dedicated to the risk function compared to any bank I've ever seen. And as a result, their compliance teams are they're basically thinking almost like product managers, where they're building in-house capabilities. And my sort of read on it over time has been the quality of suspicious activity reporting going on from those companies is probably quite a bit better than a bank that's been limited to buying an off-the-shelf vendor from an older technical platform. And you take that, the low quality reporting that the undersecretary mentioned, I had an FBI agent at one point tell me that maybe 1 in 100 SARs was actionable, because we have a little bit of a disconnect from the law enforcement community being the consumers or the customers, as he said. But the regulators are the people who are telling the financial industry what's good or bad. And when I was a bank examiner performing AML reviews, I didn't really understand what law enforcement really find useful. So I defaulted to the assumption that a 20-page, incredibly thorough narrative was the best. But then when I got exposure to what the systems on law enforcement side look like, very old COBOL database type structures that strip all of the formatting out. Like I saw an example where an export from a FinCEN database about 10 years ago was basically all in caps and with no page breaks. And that blew my mind because crypto addresses were case sensitive. So like all of the SARs we've been filing, we're having the data quality stripped out of them by the constraints of the government side database.
Wow.
So I think it's this convergence. The threat is becoming undeniable. We cannot just continue to do what we've been doing, but the opportunity exists with proven technologies and capabilities that we have now seen in certain sectors of the financial industry that we can now look at adopting more widely.
Yeah. Well, you've said on a number of occasions and things that I've listened to and read that, in your view, compliance has really become a data sciences challenge, right? And, it's a real question as to whether policymakers are keeping pace with that technology potential. We know criminals are pretty good at keeping pace or outpacing, but policymakers may still be skeptical of the role of AI, the role of automation, even if the solutions are there or can be developed. How do you see that? Do you see some of that skepticism going away? How do you read that environment right now?
I think there definitely still is skepticism, and there have been, there's a legislative proposal coming out this week on increasing thresholds for CTR and SAR filings and such, which I still think of as maybe a more old school way of thinking about how reporting should be done. But I think that there has been a big change. The Anti-Money Laundering Act from 2020 did a lot of really good things. It was trying to help FinCEN move in a direction of being creating data feedback loops and improving the quality of reporting and all these types of things. Unfortunately, I had a couple of Congress people or the staffers I was talking with who I think that they were hoping I would give them some talking points about how FinCEN was doing a bad job. And my comment to them was saying, you realize how small they are as an agency and how large their responsibility is. Like someone from FinCEN mentioned to me that after the Anti-Money Laundering Act passed, they had a matrix of all the new things they needed to do, and it equated to roughly one new thing per employee that they had. So needed more budget there. So I think on the regulatory world and the FinCEN world, those types of things, the people in there are becoming much more comfortable with more of a data-focused concept here. Mm-hmm. I think Congress is starting to move in that direction, as we've seen with the AMLA. But they're definitely, as it's not just in our ecosystem, there's definitely a desire, I think, that Congress could level up their technical capabilities. My old boss, the General Counsel of Circle, when I joined, is running for Congress, so he's hopefully will help them level up a little bit too.
Yeah, I would think so. That's really interesting. So normally when we think about the regulatory engagement in this space, it's Treasury's game, but something interesting is afoot at DoD or DOW, as we know, should call it. And it is the DARPA A3ML initiative, which is kind of an interesting initiative to come from the defense sector versus Treasury or perhaps elsewhere in the government. Are you following the A3ML project? And do you think that this engagement around DARPA and putting money into some of these AI solutions will help push forward some interesting approaches?
I had the opportunity to attend the first public briefing announcing the DARPA competition. I assume everyone knows who DARPA is, but the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and among other things, they're behind the internet. It's sort of one part of the government that I think everyone can agree is almost always incredibly effective at building impactful technology. The theme in that briefing, they kicked us about half the room out for the classified portion of it, but for the unclassified portion, they did give some examples of why DARPA and more broadly, the defense and intelligence agencies are getting involved in this. Part of it is saying financial crime and scams in particular are a national security threat. They're going directly to supporting the bottom line of adversaries of global democracies, and we should care about that. The kind of key piece to this, and when I think back to my training as a bank examiner on the anti-money laundering work we were doing, we don't really come straight out and say, like, this is one area of regulatory policy where there are adversaries. Like, so much of regulation is making sure paperwork is done properly and things don't go off the rails, and it's kind of audit and quality control. You may have bad actors in the financial industry who are trying to discriminate or exploit people or whatever it would be. But they're still kind of operating they're in your own borders and within a legal framework. In the anti-money laundering world, we're dealing with complex multinational criminal organizations who are actual intelligent human adversaries. And you can't fight them with procedures and process. So this shift of treating this stuff like the national security threat that it is something I find I'm very enthusiastic about. And what DARPA is doing, apparently whenever they're doing launch a competition, they have two standard things that they do. They have a technical thesis and I think a 10-year vision statement. The 10-year vision statement was, in 10 years, they want it to be prohibitively expensive for adversaries to move value through the financial system. And the technical thesis is, using machine learning and other types of techniques, we can create behavioral fingerprints, basically. They call them, I think, TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures. With the core goal saying they have a whole bunch of classified data sets that the financial industry would love to be able to learn what to look for based off of that. But you cannot just have a pipeline, because you'll unveil a lot of intelligence operations or tip off people that SARS has been filed. So basically, they're just saying we need to learn how to train unclassified data sets so we can share those behavioral fingerprints with the industry. So the industry can then screen for those and create this feedback loop that the industry has been clamoring for a very long period of time. It's a very complicated problem. One thing I got pretty excited about was the program manager during the briefing was asked a question for the teams that were going to compete, saying, do they have to worry about technical constraints of the existing government databases underlying all this stuff? And I'm paraphrasing here, but he basically said, kind of laughed and said, no, we will not fail in this mission due to dumb limitations of 40-year-old database structures.
That's very refreshing.
Yeah. They said it's their job to prove technology works, and they don't do policy, but they'll prove it, and then they can hand it out and say, like, I think it will give a roadmap for Congress to say, like, here's a new framework that has been proven to work over 2-year competition. Let's start re-architecting the AML regime to accommodate it.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting. I think it's a good shot in the arm for addressing some of these challenges and getting the defense infrastructure and all of the great thinking that they do on operations and joint planning and identifying the strategic outcomes. All that can be really helpful for these thorny problems. And I think we're seeing that in the economic security space writ large, whether it's the stand-up of the Office of Strategic Capital, something we were talking about on my podcast a while back, and other areas where we're using defense capacities to solve for broader economic and financial challenges, and recognizing that it is a war, that the system is really under stress and strain. And I think it's going to add something interesting to where we can go. And I guess we'll see how it goes. So thank you for sharing some of that background on that DARPA initiative. Maybe that's a good segue into this question about public-private partnerships in the AML CFT space, whether we're talking about the potential for joint pilots, sharing data standards, looking at new levels of interoperability. How do you see the public-private partnership opportunity right now? And do you think that compliance should remain primarily a private sector responsibility, or is there a case for direct government involvement in some way, given some of these new technology solutions that may be at the door?
That's a really meaty question.
Yeah.
We've had, I think, also a couple of questions come in. I don't know if we want to field any of those since they're on the A3ML topic.
Yeah, we can do that. All right, Mark P., thank you for the question.
Yeah, so I would suggest so if you Google DARPA A3ML, they have a program website, but the program director also did a podcast interview on the Alliance for Innovative Regulations podcast recently. His name is David Dewhurst. So that will be an hour-long episode really getting into the weeds. But in terms of what they're really trying to do, I think the explicit goal is to create that data feedback loop. And the way I kind of think of it is saying we have a lot of knowledge in the SAR database that it would be really helpful for the industry to have access to, like law enforcement being able to give us guidance on what to look for. And they want to be able to deliver that in a open source, using an open source model that will not be locked into any particular vendor. So number one is creating those feedback loops. I think down the road from that too, it could become like a two-way system that may sort of shift how we think about suspicious activity reporting. And so instead of having a PDF form and sort of common delineated data file or whatever it would be, we may actually end up with the ability to do sort of data packages being shared back and forth and making more investigative work more collaborative. So I think I'm reading more into it than they're explicitly saying in terms of what the downstream capabilities are, but the number one goal basically is saying by 2027, when the thing ends, they want to have the capability to create basically a government API where we could point our monitoring systems at it and then get feedback on saying, here's an evolving threat pattern we would like you to look for.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Did we have another question we wanted to take?
I saw one. My old boss, his name is John Beccia, and he's running for Congress in Massachusetts.
Okay. Excellent. That was an easy one.
Yeah.
All right. And we have another one.
So this actually leads into the question you were just teeing up on the future of regulation. I feel like we were always, with my government laptops and all these things we're using, my BlackBerry and all of that, when I was starting off, we were always about 2 software generations behind with the tools we had. And things like the FinCEN database queries and all that kind of stuff, the tech was nowhere near being modern. So I think that the future of compliance, to your question, Elaine, is probably a lot more of an actual public-private partnership and less of sort of it's become maybe a little bit more adversarial in recent years, but like exam teams go on site. For people who are, I assume most of your audience will be familiar with this, but if they're not, the quick thing is every financial institution in the country gets an exam typically once every 12 to 18 months. And that will involve a group of bank examiners going on site and embedding with them, pulling thousands and thousands of pages of materials and basically sitting in a conference room for 4 to 6 weeks and distilling it down. When the former chair of the FDIC was relatively new, Yelena McWilliams, I had the opportunity to meet with her. And when I sat down with her, she said, why in, I don't know, it was maybe 2017, are we still performing loan reviews on a sample basis, like pulling 20 loans as if that represents the whole portfolio, where we have the technical tools nowadays to do 100% statistical review and then just focus efforts on things that run awry. And that could be scary for a financial institution if your bank examiners come in and they have the ability to basically do 100% algorithmic screening of everything you've done and then find everything that went wrong.
Yeah.
But financial institutions also should be implementing these types of tools. So in an ideal future state, I feel like you're going to have a lot more automated compliance capabilities where just by using, if we call it compliance by design at Hummingbird, it's like by using the tool, the product, the output will be inherently compliant because it's built in all the requirements. If we think about that writ large, financial institutions suddenly become a lot more efficient. And you think about compliance functions, like we also get a lot of questions around is it coming for compliance officers' jobs, all this kind of stuff. I wrote an article together with a colleague of mine called The Compliance Officer of 2030 a couple of years ago. And the thesis was basically saying the top qualification for a compliance officer to get their job today is basically to be a human encyclopedia, having incredibly intimate knowledge of every nuance of regulation. But I think by the end of this decade, the primary qualification is going to be that you're more of a product manager. So you'll have dedicated engineers and data scientists who will be implementing regulatory requirements in your own financial institution's technology. You'll be running automated testing, all that kind of stuff. And maybe a future bank exam is basically just saying you created some sort of API that the government can plug into, and then they run a remote screen and then say, okay, everything's running fine, and then we don't need to have you on site for 6 weeks. As is the case with so many of the problems we face in our industry, I think this is not a technical problem. It's just sort of a status quo bias and human issue. So we have the potential to actually move towards a much more streamlined future. And one last quick point, I think in the financial crime area, like a lot of areas of compliance probably can be automated, but financial crime can't be because we have human adversaries. But if we look at a large financial institution today that may have, say, like 10,000 analysts around the world, probably 90% of them are doing tier 1 review work. And we all know transaction monitoring systems on average have 95 to 99% false positives. So you need to have a lot of people reviewing them to figure out what needs to be escalated for a human to look at, because the rest is noise.
Yeah.
If we have these better tools, you're still going to need a lot of people because the adversaries are constantly evolving. But they'll basically need to be skilled up to be doing much more interesting and I think engaging investigative work.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so interesting how the tech, I think, will ultimately push us towards what the potential and promise of the digital environment promises, right? That we need to put some guardrails and some tools in place to be able to capture the efficiencies and the technology that is offered by moving into a real digital domain. So it's going to be very interesting to see how all of this plays out. And your point about reduction of the noise, it just takes me back once again to the post 9/11 world where we were grappling with this question about the needle in the haystack. And it seems like this is the perennial challenge. How do we reduce the noise? It seems like we're getting closer and closer to being able to do that in a real-time capacity. But we're going to need some policy guardrails around that, and probably a deeper engagement on the public-private compliance opportunity. So we can stop for any other questions if we have them. Otherwise, I want to move into how we think about emerging technologies making compliance stronger and efficient, or are we just shifting the complexity from people to systems? I mean, you talked just now about the new, potentially the new role of the compliance officer, and what does that mean? But how do we solve for this challenge of information asymmetry between criminals and enforcement officials? What does that look like? How do we make the best use of people within this emerging environment that you're painting for us?
Yeah, I don't think we'll ever have a level playing field just because we all need to operate under international law and good practice and all that, and we should not be freely sharing information everywhere. But the playing field could be a lot more level than it is today. And I think the bad guys have been basically exploiting the fact that it's really difficult for us to coordinate with each other. I've been struggling for a good analogy for years, but when we launched Hummingbird, the one that I use is sort of saying that where like financial institutions are like ships sailing alone in the fog, and pirates can ship them off, pick them off individually without anyone else knowing that their neighbor has been taken out. And what we need to do is lift that fog so that when one institution's under attack, everyone else sees how they're being attacked and can accommodate it. So our fundamental goal, I think, is leveling the playing field. This is the DARPA thing is the first real. I think the AMLA, the Anti-Money Laundering Act, was directing FinCEN to try to do some of the things that DARPA is now doing. The difference now is we got Pentagon budget behind it instead of a perennially underfunded agency. So it becomes much more technically feasible to do this. But I mean, really, if we want to be truly effective in this, it needs to be an international, like bodies like FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, need to become a bit more robust and coming up with new ways of sharing information internationally that are not person-to-person communications, but system-to-system communications. You could solve financial crime if you went down a complete Big Brother dystopian type of path where we're all under a massive surveillance state. But I think that we can implement solutions here that will be incorporating our democratic goals, guaranteeing personal privacy to some degree. I mean, as an example, if you've got this kind of behavioral fingerprinting technology, like right now, our identities have been compromised 100 times over. Anyone in the West has had that situation because we have to give out our KYC data to everyone, basically. And each one of those is a point of vulnerability where if they get breached, then you're compromised. We could, in theory, have a post-A3ML ecosystem here where maybe we have to validate identity at some level. I think we'll get into this a little bit later. But you may not need to be doing traditional KYC and transaction monitoring if you have this behavioral fingerprinting capability where we can just sort of look at the behavioral characteristics of a particular criminal pattern. And then when that's detected, you dive in and figure out who's behind it. So it's sort of like a presumption of privacy at a baseline. I think if you go, a lot of the tools and capabilities that have been built out by the crypto industry may be the building blocks we need to achieve this. I think the crypto industry would probably want us to have completely private and secure money movement, but any of us who've operated in our space know that would just be a massive gift to all the bad guys out there. And I just want to sort of make the argument, this is not it's a false dichotomy. We could be going, it's not an either or proposition. We can actually engineer a solution that strikes a middle path that balances all of these goals.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to pick up on your FATF comment. This was actually a big week, or was it last week? The Financial Action Task Force plenary met, and there were a number of countries coming off the gray list, which was kind of interesting. It got me thinking about what's the connectivity between some of these important multilateral tools and frameworks like FATF and where we go on these new technologies and, federated learning systems, machine learning. How much of the solution that might be coming will need to be deployed beyond our borders, our physical borders? I mean, it almost seems like physical borders are just irrelevant to this, other than the legal and regulatory frameworks that come along with that. Even those probably need to be rethought. But how do you see this opportunity, or maybe more so the challenge of global interoperability, and where do we start on that? Do we start at home and then think about the multilateral engagement, or are we trying to build a system that is kind of globally aligned?
I've been a very big believer in open source software for a long time. I think if we went down the path the way governments tend to think about deploying technology. It tends to be very top down. They'll spend 4 years scoping it out and another 10 years building something that by the time it's released is 3 generations behind the cutting edge. I do think it is true that we can't fight international crime locally. We need to come up with a better solution that gets countries aligned with each other and able to move much faster, especially as we have things like stable coins coming online and people can move money nearly instantaneously almost anywhere. You cannot we've had kind of the ability to rely on the fact that we're running on batch processes that may take a number of days to move money in a lot of cases, which gives us time to catch up to the bad guys. I think one of the big problems, there was a book, I think it was titled Breakneck by an author who was sort of analyzing how China's growth has happened. And one of the big points that the author made was that Western policy is typically, policymakers are typically lawyers. And in China, policymakers are often engineers.
Yeah.
I think that what we really need is much more of a 50-50 split in the room of technical people and legal people to come to figure out what the standards should be. The standards coming out from that should be an open source ecosystem that's not relying on any particular government or software vendor or provider to try to solve all the problems for everyone. The fact that the output from the DARPA Ethereum program will be open sourced is a very material thing, I think. Sorry, I had to decline a call there. So they're going, that is foundation. Also, I may be wrong about this, but I think that this program may also have been tacitly embraced by the Five Eyes partners.
Oh, that's
so. Yeah, if the output then leads to the Five Eyes countries sort of moving their AML regimes, that becomes sort of maybe a crystal that could catalyze a wider shift.
Yeah.
So if I were to sum it down, I think that we need to be having more engineers caring about this. A book I recommend to everyone is Jennifer Palka, founder of Code for America, wrote a book called Recoding America.
Yeah.
And for all my engineer friends, I recommend it to them, saying, if you want to understand why government technology is so hard, this book is excellent. And then for all my policymaker friends, I recommend it, saying, like, if you want to understand how frustrating the technical world finds it to work in government constraints, this is also a great book. So that book right there, I think, is sort of the core of how we need to think about this.
Yeah, so interesting. Very, very keen to hear that there may be interest from the Five Eye group of countries in following the DARPA project, or maybe looking at some opportunity for interoperability. I do a lot of work in the trade space, and we've been thinking and writing about this idea of creating something like a near global economy where we have aligned countries that agree to certain rules around free and fair trade. And it strikes me that it's not unrelated to this question about interoperability of AML, CFT, and other regulatory frameworks that ultimately support a free trade environment. And so we have to think about that as well. If we're in this moment, a huge moment of reorientation around thinking through our trade relationships, our trading partners, our economic security partnerships, what does it mean to bring this piece, this really important financial integrity piece into a new frame? And then what ultimately would that mean for an organization like FATF, or maybe a new organization that needs to be tasked with this alignment around interoperability and standards? So lots to think about. You got me thinking about this now. So excellent. Do we want to stop for a question or two? Great. Thanks, Craig.
That's a good question. The way I tend to think about it is, yes, AI is a major tool, but it is not a standalone solution for all of this. And the thing, I kind of made this point earlier, but if I were to really say what I think is wrong with transaction monitoring, It's that it fails to account for the fact that we have intelligent adversaries. So in the more traditional way of doing transaction monitoring is rules-based, so we're writing a bunch of like if statements to try to narrowly define the pattern that we're looking for. The problem is once the rule is then in effect, the bad guys see that they're being blocked, and then they tweak some aspect of the rule or their approach, and then that rule isn't firing anymore for the actual criminals, but it's just inadvertently triggering on innocent people. Or the rules are written so broadly. I experienced this personally with a toolkit at Circle when I inadvertently shut off the entire MIT campus after we'd given them all a promotional partnership deal. Because we had a rule saying that new account creation velocity exceeding a certain threshold within a certain time period would block all further account creations. But every student at MIT was connecting to our system through the same IP. So that was a sort of harsh lesson for me when everyone's yelling at me like, why is this promotion not working? So maybe one way to think about it is the data points that transaction monitoring systems typically look at are constrained normally by your customer identity information and then characteristics of the transaction. So maybe 20, 30 data points, where financial institutions have been investing in treating this more as a machine learning solution, maybe dealing with hundreds or thousands of data points. And the shift is it's no longer like a binary, this is a flag or not type of discussion. It's sort of saying we've got a data cloud here, and we can come to a higher level of statistical certainty that something weird is going on. And an important part of that too is we tend to think of transaction monitoring as looking for bad patterns. But if you start thinking of machine learning in this space, you can actually train models to understand what your normal customer behavior looks like, and then just look for anomalies from that. And then the human investigator goes and looks at the anomaly and says, is this bad or is it good? If it's good, you go back and train the model saying this is a normal expected behavior. And if it's bad, then you know what to look for in the future. So AI is not a panacea for this, but data sciences broadly, I think, is a panacea. So AI will be one of the tools underneath it, but it's going to come down to your people, your investigators being equipped to learn how to run SQL queries and test theories and build their own custom models and all that kind of stuff. And I think if we end up upskilling the good guys with that type of approach and those types of tools, that will be a really impactful thing in our global fight against the bad guys here.
Excellent. We probably have time for one more question.
I'm a big believer in modernizing identity to allow for, I'm trying to think about the way to say it. I think self-sovereign may be a challenge just because of realities of international law and governments and all these types of things. But I definitely think we need to have an identity approach that takes in a lot of these types of factors. So saying like, you don't just hand over your driver's license to someone to go into a bar is the classic example. Identity through attestation, I think, is going to be a major breakthrough here, where once again, it's a data cloud type of thing. So instead of relying on a government document to say, I am who I say I am, maybe that's one of the attestations, but also I've got relationships with 15 different companies that have verified my physical address. I've got my employer and all these other things. All of those could be sort of tokenized attestations attached to my identity that give a high degree of certainty that I'm a real person and I am who I say I am. And then when I need to authenticate at an airport or something like that, they don't need to see the full identity. You can just get a confirmation that maybe with a biometric thing on my device that just unlocks it. There are a lot of people who have been working on this behind the scenes in government for a long period of time. I think that they've never really had the political capital to make it happen. But I do think, as with a lot of the other things we're talking about here, the explosion in scams is likely to be one of the forcing functions to actually start making policymakers take this seriously. Like, if we had an ability to immediately validate who we're talking to on the other side of the phone or whatever it would be, so romance scams would cease to be a thing. It would blow up the entire economic model of a lot of scam patterns. So I hope that identity will be one of the first, even just proof of personhood, like knowing I am an individual human and my device is tied to me individually and has not created 100 other identities would make a huge difference.
Absolutely. Do we have one more? Because we're going to move. Yeah, perfect.
Ooh, yeah, that's a good question. I think we have an inherent challenge in the US compared to a lot of other countries because of how many regulators we have. And they all have somewhat overlapping mandates compared to some other countries like the UK, which has sort of a single unified regulator that can see the whole picture. Our system is designed the way it is for a reason throughout our history, but it does really represent a challenge when we're talking about threats that cut across all the jurisdictions, all the different regulatory bodies we're talking about here. And like the FFIEC, the Financial Institution Investigation Council, I think it's council, anyway, government acronyms, which has all the main regulatory bodies on it as members. It basically, I feel like most of what they do is sort of standardizing guidance across them and creating exam handbooks. I think what Congress really should think about doing is creating a new body or giving something like the FFIEC resources and dedicated engineers to start building technical connectivity between them. Like if we have each regulatory agency going off to some government contractor and procuring a tech stack that doesn't inherently interoperate with every other regulator, it's a own goal situation. We're just hurting ourselves. So we need to start thinking about these things as systemic. Like, doesn't matter what regulatory body it is, the technical platforms will be the same. That could really be a great starting point.
Yeah, I think you're touching on something really important, which is this question about effectiveness of the dialogue between policymakers, regulators, and compliance innovators. What does that look like? Is there a framework for that? Is there an example of where the dialogue is working really well? Or is this something that needs to be created, maybe even legislated in a way that you suggested?
I started nerding out a bit early in the history of the company and learning about the origins of the internet. And if we think about the fact the entire internet ecosystem relies on all of us having agreed to a set of standards that make every web page work with any web browser we want to choose as an alternative to like everyone's on AOL or CompuServe or whatever it would have been. So I think that there are models that we could look to, but they don't really exist in our space. Like the people who determine how the internet standards evolve, it's like IC3 and some other bodies that create these mandates and then create open source standards that then everyone can go and plug into. And those are public-private bodies. Like ICANN is another group that is involved in that for internet domain stuff. So I think there was a book called Range that I really like, which was sort of exploring the differences between generalized and specialized skills. And they had an anecdote in there, which is saying that there's a professor that would rate his students based off of their ability to come up with FAR analogies. Just like you get bonus points the further away from your field of expertise the analogy is, the better, because it means that you're learning from all sorts of different areas of expertise. So yeah, I think that we need to kind of start. The field of regulation is so complex and so deep that we've been rewarded for a very long period of time by becoming human encyclopedias. And I think we need to start seeing what we can learn from other sectors, and then also doing our best to make other sectors care about the work that we're doing, which I think is a threat in the deregulatory sphere today, where a lot of people sort of say, like, what is this even doing? We're spending huge amounts of money and not achieving any results. Why are we bothering? We need to get better at getting people to care about the mission and understand why it's important.
Yeah. Yeah. So I want to take us back to the beginning of the conversation where you made the comment that if we were designing the AML CFT system today, we probably wouldn't replicate what we have. So how would you think about a redesign, and what would be the principles that would guide it? So if Congress were saying, all right, it's time to rethink this, where would you start in terms of the core principles that would lay out the system in a way that makes more sense?
I would start with identity and coming up with an approach that doesn't rely on documents that can be generated by a large language model image generator in about 3 seconds that then can pass our current document verification tools. I guess maybe I'll answer it in a slightly different way. What we should be thinking about here is crime as a business model, and finding ways to make it more expensive for them to commit the crime. So if they cannot use a single device to spin up 100 or 1,000 identities, then they suddenly need to have basically the equivalent of a money mule for every fake account that they try to spin up. So that's a big expense and a lot of points of vulnerability for them. If we have an ability to share information amongst each other, even if it's not super granular, but understanding, like the dream version would be like a new threat vector is some criminal entity comes up with a new idea and they use it. And the first financial institution that gets hit with it then can kind of have like an immune system antibody response where they learn the characteristics of that pattern and then it gets shared with the entire financial industry. So that exact same technique will not work on the next bank down the road or the next bank. They all learn from the first one that was hit. I think if you did those two things, fix identity and enable information sharing, suddenly a lot of criminal activity would maybe not become economically viable anymore. And that's a gross simplification of what the meat of the problem would be. But I mean, just having Congress looking at this and sort of saying, like, let's create a new framework and let's actually put, if it is a national security priority, let's put national security money behind figuring out a path. Let's rely on it as rely on open source solutions that, like, if we invest in building it in the US or in the Five Eyes jurisdictions, then anyone else around the world can adopt it seamlessly and then will become interoperable with those countries. I feel like that there's more of a light at the end of the tunnel there than anything else I could come up with, I think.
Yeah. Well, for what it's worth, I agree with you. I think the concept of digital identity is really at the heart of the systemic change that we've been talking about. It's not only because it's central to how we verify and monitor transactions, but it's really about, as you said, the core of the national security challenge. And it's not just in this context. Most national security challenges have an identity component, whether we're talking about immigration challenges or we're talking about terror finance, we're talking about trade-related challenges, you name it. So I think we have to crack that code, and it seems like it would be exactly the right place to start. Let's open it up. We have a few more questions, I think, and a bit more time, a few minutes anyway. So let's see what else we have. Or maybe we've answered all the questions.
Yeah, I think that maybe there were some more comments in prior questions.
Okay. All right. Very good. All right. Matt, anything else that you want to touch on before we close out for today?
So our company marketing team is quite funny, and they often come up with good compliance humor related things to give out at conferences. One of our most popular things was a sticker that just said "compliance saves money," and I was sort of picturing people putting that sticker onto laptops and going into meetings with business line and then opening a laptop and just sort of subtly making the point. So I hope that, I know we are going into a lot of conversations around changing regulation and sort of deregulatory pressures. I think it is important for the compliance and financial crime industry broadly to not take everything for granted. We need to learn how to articulate the mission the point we made before, say make people care about this, and be open towards breaking out from sort of saying we've had the rule books in effect for a very long period of time, and I think a lot of compliance professionals will tend to sort of default to saying like, look, it's written in the book here, therefore we need to do it. Encourage everyone to sort of take that, open the lens up a little bit, and be willing to entertain the idea of saying, well, maybe if it's in the rule book, but it isn't working, should we explore changing it? And then figure out how to collaborate from there. So that FAR analogies thing is really the key here. I think it's getting other people with other skill sets in the room, all of us understanding like we've got a lot to contribute in terms of deep subject matter expertise and understanding of how all these adversaries work. And then just always ask ourselves, like, is what we're doing achieving that mission? Are we making the bad guys' lives more difficult? And I think we start asking those questions widely. We both have a much more strong argument against people who want to just sort of deregulate everything. But also, I think all of us, there's nothing more soul crushing than being an analyst who's dealing with 99% false positives. That's right. Just, that job is not a fun job. No, if it changes to like maybe 50% of the time you're looking at something that actually is a bad guy doing something, that makes the job. That's why we do this work. We care about this stuff. Yeah. So I think I'd probably say that. Yeah. Great. Wonderful. Well, there's hope for the compliance officer and maybe making this job a little bit easier over time. Well, I want to thank you for being with us today. It's been a great conversation, and thanks to your team at Hummingbird for collaborating on this episode, and thanks to our friends at Illicit Edge for hosting us today. So thank you guys for doing this work. We need more channels like this that are telling these stories. So we were really excited when you guys launched, and happy to support you. Thanks so much, Matt. It's been a pleasure. Likewise.